All right. A couple of housekeeping things. I'm a bozo and screwed up the syllabus here. The 21st is Tuesday. I don't know why when I was putting the syllabus together, I thought we met Monday, Wednesday. So I'm trying to think of what would be the best thing to do. We can move all the lectures up one, have class on Tuesday, and that'll just be the nature versus nurture, then we do the biology of mind, etc. Or, now, the positive of doing that is if we move all the classes up one, on the 4th, we can do a review day for the exam. Or, we could just not have class on Tuesday. Show of hands, who wants to move everything up? All right, that's sufficient to say we're just going to move everything up. We'll keep the deadlines for these as they are, in case you all have planned for them. So I'm not going to move the actual chapter dates up. So some of them you'll be doing after the actual class. But we're going to move everything else up, with the exception, dispensation and perception, I'm going to do on the 28th, and we're going to keep Jake lecturing on the 30th. Questions about that? All the Cengage stuff will stay the same. All those due dates. Which takes me to the next point. What chapter we're on is on the syllabus here on the right-hand side. So make sure you're doing those chapters. So what you see on Cengage is just going to be numerical order. So chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's not going to show up as chapter 8 is next. So you have to do chapter 8 for this class. Again, I'll say it for the 47th time in class. They're due the day before class. This is the last time I'm extending the deadline. So you now have until Sunday night to do chapter 8. Don't ask me again. I'm not going to keep doing it. Questions about Cengage? Or the due dates? Or the assignments? Or what we're doing in class? Yes?
Is there any way you can set Cengage up to any one school's next?
I don't know. I have the instructor view, so I don't know what it shows you on yours. Do you know the answer, or is that a question?
Yeah, when you do, it has like that little calendar icon, that should like it'll list it all.
So for those of y'all who didn't hear, when you go to Cengage, you should have a little calendar icon, and that'll tell you when they're due. Is that right? Cool. Other questions? Cool. All right. Starting today, what did we learn last time? Biases? Yeah. Can you give me an example of one of the biases we talked about? Overconfidence. Yeah. So what is the overconfidence bias? Yeah. Yeah, maybe you are placing too much confidence in the weatherman. Yeah.
We talked about heuristics.
What are heuristics?
They're like shortcuts your brain takes so it doesn't kind of itself out of decision making.
Okay. And can you give me an example of a heuristic?
Like the concept that you're more afraid to get on a plane than you are to go to the airport, even though you're more afraid about harassment.
Yeah. And do you remember what that heuristic is called?
Availability.
Yes. And what's the other heuristic we talked about? Yes. I don't know who said that, but whoever said that, can you give me an example of what the representative heuristic is?
The thing with like the banker, or like Linda's a banker, or she's like a feminist or whatever it was.
Yeah, banker and feminist.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, so because it's inherently reliant on the probability that it's always going to be less likely that you're two things than you're just one of those things, yet people continue to establish some sort of representation of what a banker or a librarian or somebody who is active in the feminist movement would look like. What else did we talk about? Yeah.
The system 1 and system 2.
Okay. And so what's the difference between system 1 and system 2?
System 1 is the gut instinct, and system 2 is the just thinking through the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Somebody give me another example of a bias we talked about. Yeah.
Can we talk about, like, is framing the one where you give, like, a car dealership gives a really good price, and then they're like, you'll save $3,000, but really you get extra $3,000 and get right back?
Yeah, so that could work for both the framing and anchoring. The framing is, okay, what is the kind of messaging we're putting on this? And so, you know, you get a car and $3,000. Well, not really. We also talked about the 80% lean meat versus 20% fat. It means the same thing, but again, it's that framing there. Give me one more. Yeah.
Authority bias.
Okay. So I don't think we talked about the authority bias last time. Somebody else give me an example.
The hindsight,
Hindsight bias? Yep. And what's the hindsight bias? Yeah, exactly. Hindsight's 20/20. Everybody says, "Oh yeah, obviously we knew that all along, or we should have known that." Nope, not the case. All right, your fun fact of the day. Guinness Book of World Records has refused to validate any attempt at the world record for longest time spent awake, believing it's dangerous to human health. The current record is set at 264 hours, or around 11 days, which was set by a high school student as a science project. Yeah, it's not great. My cousin was in the Army and was a ranger, and he went to ranger school. And what they're doing, in addition to caloric deprivation and all the other training, is sleep deprivation. So they average about 3 hours of sleep a night for 60 days. He said at the end of it, people were hallucinating so bad, he saw one guy trying to put dollar bills into a tree, thinking it was a vending machine. Another guy standing behind a pole, thinking that was part of the formation there. So yeah, sleep deprivation is not a good thing to go through.
What chapter are you lecturing on?
8. Yeah. So, as I'm sure all of y'all have been exposed to up to this point, either in your college career or before your college career, the foundation for scientific discovery is what we call the scientific method. We can conceptualize that scientific method into 3 distinct stages: theory, hypotheses, and then the testing of that theory. Or excuse me, of the hypothesis. So what makes a good scientific theory? Well, first it has to be specific. Right? The whole purpose of scientific exploration is the ability to predict the future. And general theories are not predictive in nature. Right? A bad theory is that there will be some temperature outside tomorrow. Yes, obviously, but that's not predictive in any manner. It also has to be falsifiable. What does falsifiable mean? Yeah, you have to be able to prove it wrong. You can't have a theory that's impossible to prove wrong. Right? And so sometimes we talk about philosophical arguments or religious arguments, and that's where those come in. But in science, you don't want to have a theory that you just can't prove wrong, because it doesn't benefit the scientific community. You don't have the opportunity to any longer say, well, that's not right, and in place of that is this theory. So an example of a good theory would be increased sleep boosts memory, boosts performance. Remember we talked about some of the research that's looked at this, you're better off going to sleep rather than pulling an all-nighter and sitting for an exam? An example of a bad theory would be saying sleep and memory are related to one another. Why is that not a good theory? Or why is that a bad theory? It's really general. Yeah?
Just both positive and negative correlation with each other.
Yeah, it just says they're related to one another. Exactly. Yeah.
It can be really hard to falsify.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to say, okay, if you're not saying what the relationship is or what the mechanism is, they're just related to one another. Well, we've already shown examples of correlations that are related to one another. They can just be spurious, be random, and we'll show more of those today. Exactly. So now we have a general, maybe general is not the right term, an overarching theory. And from that, we derive a research hypothesis. What you don't want to do in developing that hypothesis, I don't know why I struggle with that word, hypothesis, is say, okay, I'm just going to pick what I think, what my gut instinct would be about this, without any sort of foundational or background research to base that theory off of. And we'll talk about why that's a bad idea later today when we talk about some of the issues with statistics and replication. But if you're just picking hypotheses kind of off the shelf and testing them, you may find these spurious correlations that you're not contextualizing, or these spurious effects that you're not contextualizing in the greater overall theory, which would allow you to evaluate whether or not you may have made methodological or statistical errors or mistakes. And again, you want that hypothesis to be testable. And then finally, once we get to the testing part, we have to think about three specific components of good testing. First, you have to operationalize your variables. What does operationalize mean? Yeah.
Maybe make like working definitions that you can actually test and measure the different variables.
Yeah, so if we're interested in whether sleep boosts memory, what type of memory are we talking about? Do we mean semantic memory? Are we talking about your ability to recall words? And what do we mean by sleep? Do we mean REM sleep? Do we mean number of hours your eyes are closed? So you have your concepts, but you need to create some sort of specification of those variables. Secondly, you have to develop the set of testing procedures. All right, so that's going to differ by different fields of study. But you want to make sure you've got procedures in place that are actually going to measure what you want to measure. You can think of extreme examples where that wouldn't be the case. Right? If I want to test the effects of whether sleep can boost memory performance, I don't want to then ask about some sort of subjective experience of humor instead of memory. And while that's an extreme example, you want to think about when you're actually doing the testing procedures, whether or not you've set up these procedures that are specifically getting at what you want to get based off of your operationalization. So if I want to know if sleep boosts semantic memory, so again, memory for word lists, maybe I don't want to have a test or a procedure that has just a series of pictures. Third, most obviously, you then have to collect the data. And so we'll talk about some of the issues associated with data collection later in class today. This is all pretty straightforward. So now we've collected all of our data. Here comes the fun part. You have to analyze it, and then you have to figure out what the data tells you. Right? So at the beginning of this semester, I said that data don't lie, but people lie about data. Whether it's intentional or not, remember we just talked about different biases, like the confirmation bias. You can look at a set of data, and it can tell you a completely different story than what the data tell me based off of our expectations about what that data should say or what we want it to say. So you have to put on that critical thinking hat and say, okay, does this support the hypothesis? Or does it contradict or refute that hypothesis? So, maybe our hypothesis was that sleeping 8 or more hours a night increases semantic memory, your retention for those words. And the data show that those who slept for 8 or more hours remembered more words off of a list than those who slept less than 8 hours. So that supports the hypothesis. And once we've evaluated against the hypothesis, we then have to take it that step back up and evaluate against the theory. So maybe we have a theory about attention. Oopsies, excuse me. We have a theory about attention such that you only have a finite amount of resources. Attention as a pool of resources. And sleep helps replenish those resources. And once we deplete the resources and we're not filling it back up with our sleep, you're no longer able to devote those resources to remembering semantic lists. And so this helps not only support our theory, but also refine it. It helps us start looking for those mechanisms that can explain the data in the theory itself. So is anybody familiar with the law of large numbers or law of small numbers? So the law of small numbers is pretty intuitive. Everybody can get there with their own reasoning. But it says that at smaller sample sizes, you're more likely to have more extreme values. Right? Think about it. If I flip a coin 2 times, I may be very likely to get 100% heads. Whereas if I flip a coin 200 times, unless that coin's weighted, I'm almost certainly not going to get 100% heads. So interestingly, this is one of the reasons why you find the highest and lowest rates of cancer in small communities. Because you have smaller numbers in the population, and so a couple people getting cancer can dramatically increase the overall percentage of the population that has cancer there. And so you'll see on the news all the time of, oh, look at this community, they've been devastated by whatever. What's the cause of that? Well, half the time the cause is just it's a small community. It's more susceptible to extreme values. The flip side of that is that law of large numbers, which says we're kind of neutralizing that propensity for extremes by increasing the overall sample size. And the same thing holds true in scientific bodies of literature. Right? No one study is sufficient to tell us the way the world works. And handfuls of studies can be wrong. I mean, they can be wrong for methodological reasons. They can be wrong for interpretation of the data. They can also be wrong for statistical reasons. And so what we need is a big body of literature to be able to say, okay, this is most likely the way the world actually works, or the way the brain works. You know, if I find one study that says, actually, those with 3 or less hours of sleep a night do better on word retention. Well, in isolation, nothing may seem wrong with that study, but it's not until we compare it against the breadth of all the other studies that have been done on sleep and memory performance that we can start to say, okay, that one effect likely wasn't real. Bless you. So for that reason, we need to run replication studies. We can think about replications as being either direct or indirect. A direct replication is a study that does everything the exact same way. It's like you just hit repeat on the study. Do it again. An indirect replication is largely the same as the initial study, but now we've changed 1 or 2 variables, or we add another variable to the equation. So we're still replicating that initial main effect. We can still add to the body of literature to say, yes, this is an important effect, or yes, this seems to be a legitimate effect, or no, those early studies were wrong. But now we're adding to that body of literature in addition. Now we're starting to find other mechanisms or the overall breadth of things that are affected by sleep deprivation, for example. Questions about any of that so far? That makes sense? Perfect. So like I said, one study does not prove an effect. We also need to think about the fact that in science you're never really proving anything. You're adding support for theories, but the purpose of science isn't to prove things, right? You can't prove things in the same way that maybe you could convince people, right? In the courtroom, we have beyond a reasonable doubt. Prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And we can treat things as if they're absolutes, like gravity. We don't have any reason to believe that at any point gravity is just going to shut off, cease to exist. But it might, right? We can't prove that gravity is going to exist in all facets of time and space from here to eternity. You got pretty good evidence it's not going anywhere anytime soon, but again, it's not proving that specifically. So again, it takes multiple studies, and that's where the meta-analyses and the review papers come in to provide compelling evidence in favor and effect. And so, who's heard the whole vaccines cause autism thing? Probably most of y'all. That's complete bunk. For several reasons, it's complete bunk. So this is a case of where large bodies of literature are important. This early study came out from a group over in England, I think it was, and they found a relationship between vaccines and autism. Took the world by storm. They said, oh my God, we need to stop vaccinating our kids. However, after the fact, it came out that they fabricated the data. They just made it up. And all but one of the authors admitted to lying about the data. And they were all punished. I don't remember what was the exact punishment, but I think they had some of their certifications removed, etc. And so again, if we're treating every one study as conclusive evidence, like the public sometimes does, we make drastic changes based off of one series of data. Now, it could also be that they could find this effect without fabricating the data. Maybe they found some sort of relationship between vaccines and autism. But the vast majority of literature suggests that vaccines don't cause autism. And one of the reasons these authors were forced to recant their publication, bless you, and admit that they lied and made up the data, is because people tried to do direct replications of the data and didn't find the effects that they were reporting. And after enough of those come up, questions start coming up and saying, okay, something was either off with your measurement or you just made stuff up. Turns out they made stuff up.
Why?
It's a very good question. So the question was, why did they make stuff up? Within academia, there's this whole idea, what we call publish or perish. So you have to publish data to get promoted, and if you're not publishing, you get fired. At a lot of top-tier institutions, top-tier research institutions, not only do you have to publish, but you have to publish in really top-tier journals. And top-tier journals don't want to publish just small ho-hum findings. They want to publish findings that completely revolutionize a field. I don't know if this is specifically why they did this, but this is my speculation. So by making up the data, they can publish it in a top-tier journal, get a lot of citations, and that helps their career. Don't do it, though. You'll be found out. So you also may have heard of this concept of a replication crisis. So psychology was one of the first disciplines to make a concerted effort to study the replications of studies. I don't remember exactly how many it was, but it was a consortium of authors went out and reached out to different leaders in their respective disciplines within psychology and said, all right, we want you to pick the most fundamental research paper in your field, and we want you to do a direct replication. So we want you to do everything the exact same way, and then report the findings back to us. And what you would hope is that most of the articles that have been published of, hey, these are real effects, would replicate, right? Everything was done the exact same way. But in reality, between a third and a half of the studies weren't replicated, depending on which criterions you're using and statistics and whatnot. That's a big deal, because these aren't just random papers. They're papers that were picked because they were foundational within the field. And so about 5 years ago, the field of psychology had kind of this identity crisis of, holy crap, everything we're publishing is wrong. What do we need to do? And there were a lot of fields saying, see, we told you the soft sciences are bogus. You shouldn't be studying them. And then the other field said, well, maybe we should see if we're able to replicate. Turns out that about half of medical cancer studies don't replicate. And so you'll hear these things of, new results suggest whatever can help treat cancer or prevent cancer. But even in these typical hard sciences, and I'm just picking on medicine here, but it's across the board, tend not to replicate either. And so this is an overarching issue for all scientific fields, partially caused by the statistical methods that we train aspiring grad students on, or even undergrads. But this is why replication is so important. We want to be able to say with some degree of certainty that this is a real effect. But if we're not doing these direct replications, we can't say with any degree of certainty that it is a real effect and not just some sort of spurious correlation. So again, this doesn't necessarily mean that a whole bunch of people are fabricating data. What it likely means is that we need to reform our statistical methods and our measurement methodology to allow us to have better certainty when we're reporting things that these are real effects. So talk with your neighbor and develop a theory about the world. There we go. For example, Dr. T is the best teacher in the psych department. That'd be hard to argue after I just stumbled over that easy sentence right above it. And then develop a hypothesis to test the theory. So for example, Dr. T's students will do better on tests than any other section. Make sure you're operationalizing your variables. So talk with your neighbor, and then we're going to design some studies.
Coming up with our own. Chick-fil-A is the best for us.
Well, you could do that and then like, test it by
Take 46 more seconds.
having you say something. And then having it pass memory test about what you say as opposed to your other, or as opposed to other sources. Don't listen as you
Oh, well,
this
Chick-fil-A.
segment of like kids.
Is that all right?
What?
About Chick-fil-A.
Fine by me, man. I like Chick-fil-A. I don't like how long lines always look even when they move fast. All right, who has a theory that they're going to then develop a hypothesis off of? I know y'all do because I heard your theory here. You want to go?
I just want to share.
Well, too bad. All right, I'm going to pick on y'all. Yeah, go ahead. What was your theory?
Okay, Chick-fil-A is the best fast food restaurant.
Okay. So what is your hypothesis based off of that?
Well,
They have stated that they don't use,
we
what is
check
it?
the menu items.
No.
So that's the actual testing here.
Yeah.
But what is the hypothesis you're going to test?
Well, they're the best because their menu entirely focuses on chicken. That's the best meat. And
Don't use steroids, so you're gonna test to see if they actually use steroids and if they don't.
Okay. So you've got a theory that Chick-fil-A is the best restaurant in the world. I'm
Fast
going to
food.
no, I'm going to expand it. And part of being the best means you don't lie to your customers. And so the hypothesis is going to be that Chick-fil-A does in fact not use steroids in their chickens. And then we're going to test it. How are we operationalizing the variables?
find their supplier, get their chicken.
Okay. And so what do we mean by steroids?
Like,
Do we mean anabolic steroids, like getting them pumped? Or do we mean... Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Use lab testing.
All right. Cool. Here's a fun fact for y'all. This only has to do with Chick-fil-A and not psychology. Chick-fil-A is the #1 most profitable franchise per capita by store. They do over $1 million per store more than McDonald's does, and they're open one less day a week. That's amazing. Chick-fil-A's the best. There is the definition that we're looking for.
that's why they're closed on Sunday. They got to give everyone else a chance.
They've got to give everyone else a chance. I love it. That's great. All right, who else has another theory? Yeah.
Okay, so our theory is that there's a correlation between the type of music to which students listen to during studying and academic performance. I
Okay.
think this is a good theory because it can directly disprove it by showing there is no significant performance distribution. One of our testable hypotheses is that students that listen to heavy metal during studying will score significantly poor on tests and those listening to less scores. We would need multiple of these hypotheses to show
For those of y'all who couldn't hear him, the theory was that there is a relationship between music that students listen to while they study and their academic performance. Their hypothesis was that if you listen to classical music while studying, you'll do better than if you listen to metal music. Yeah. And so, interestingly enough, that's been tested. Don't listen to music with words in it while you're studying. That interferes with your phonological loop. It may seem like you're being more productive, that you're in a flow state, but what it actually means is you are devoting more attentional resources to tuning out the words coming in as you're reading words that you're trying to study. So, you'd be better off listening to classical music than metal. Although some metal songs, I know they're speaking English, but I struggle to figure out what they're saying. So, yes, Viking metal. There's also a Mongolian death metal band that plays like not sitars, but some like equivalent of it. It's amazing. Yeah, I love it. All right. So when there's a relationship between variables, we can classify it into two main categories: correlational and causational. So we've already talked a little bit about correlational. What do you think causational relationships would be? Yeah, one directly causes the other. Can you give me an example? That's okay. So, causational would be increase in temperature makes you sweat. There can also be reciprocal causation where sweating increases the humidity and then it raises the temperature. But in this case, raising the temperature makes you sweat. So, we've already talked a little bit about this, but this is so important to me, hint, hint, it may be on your test, hint, hint, definitely will be on your test, that variables that are correlated with each other can predict one another, but they cannot say that one causes the other. So I think we talked about this. Now, as ice cream sales increase, so too do shark attacks. So does that mean that eating ice cream causes people to get attacked by sharks? Or maybe shark attacks cause people to want to calm their nerves by eating ice cream? Bless you. Or it could just be that it gets hot outside, more people go in the water and get attacked by sharks, and also more people eat ice cream. True or false? Correlation implies causation. Yes. Perfect. We can cancel the rest of class forever. You all know exactly what you need to know. And we still have to take the exams, but... So we can think of two different types of correlations. Positive and negative. Now, an important characteristic of these, or an important thing to remember of these, is positive and negative are not value judgments. Positive doesn't mean good, negative doesn't mean bad. They refer to what's happening in that relationship. So in a positive correlation, as one variable increases, so too does that other variable. Right? So on the left-hand side, as variable B increases, so too does variable A. As variable B decreases, so too does variable A. So again, this could be ice cream sales and shark attacks. The flip side of that is a negative correlation, whereas one variable increases, the other decreases. Right? So you can see at higher levels of variable A, variable B is lower, and vice versa. So who can give an example of a positive correlation? Yeah?
Increase your
Yeah. So a good positive correlation is the amount of time you study and your overall grade on the exam. Who can give me an example of a negative correlation? Somebody else. You've got this one down. All right, we'll go with you.
Okay, the increase in safety measures will result in a decrease of injuries.
Yeah. So an increase in percentage of people wearing their seat belts when they drive leads to a decrease in automobile accidents. And actually what I just said is incorrect. There's a relationship such that at higher levels of seatbelt compliance, there are lower fatalities. Questions about the distinctions between positive and negative correlations? True or false? A negative correlation is a bad thing.
False.
Yes. Perfect. If a question like that is on the exam and somebody writes true, I will probably quit on the spot. And then you'll have to have some substitute. That may be good for some of y'all, but... Alright, so here are more spurious correlations because I love these things. The number of people who drowned by falling into a pool correlates with films that Nicolas Cage appeared in. Yes?
People watching Nicolas Cage movies want to drown themselves.
Yeah, there may be a causational effect there. Does anybody know how many films Nicolas Cage is going to star in 2020?
As much as he needs until he can pay off his taxes.
Well, hopefully not that many.
Your lecture on chapter 2.
So there's a bit of chapter 2, that's why we preceded it, and there's also some in chapter 8. Letters and winning words of Scripps National Spelling Bee correlates with the number of people killed by venomous spiders. I don't know how that one works.
It's not good.
So again, for the love of God, I want this hammered into all of your brains such that you can be that annoying person on Facebook that says correlation does not imply causation. That's me.
You still use Facebook?
Yes, I still use Facebook. If any of y'all say, okay, boomer, I'll kill you.
Okay.
Just kidding, I won't kill you.
The meme's dead already.
The meme's dead. I'm not even cool enough for pretending to be old. So we already talked about a couple of these. Diet of fish can prevent teen violence. Phantom room seems to cut infants' risk of crib death. Here's another one. Back off barista. Coffee may heighten Alzheimer's symptoms. Eat nuts, live longer.
Okay, time.
Yeah, I mean, these are all from reputable sources. This is The Guardian. This is New York Times. This is Time. I don't remember what this one is. But, again, just because there's a correlation does not mean there's a causation. Frequently, with studies that report things like eat nuts, live longer, what they did is take people's dietary habits and then see how many people died. So they're going to find some association just by chance, right? Maybe it's the case that eating more cashews will make you live longer. Or maybe just those who eat more cashews are also more health conscious and therefore live longer. And now that you all understand correlation and causation, I'm sure you'll find this hilarious. I'll give you a second to read it. And when I hear uproarious laughter, I'll assume you've all read it. I'll just assume y'all can't see it, and that's why you're not laughing. So to infer causality, you need to control for every other variable. Right? We can find correlations, we can find relationships between the variables. But until we control for everyone, either statistically or methodologically, procedurally, we can't infer causation. So let's say we wanted to, wow, that's a well-formed sentence. Let's say we wanted to see if violent video games made you more violent. What should we do? I didn't hear it. What?
No, nothing, I read.
Okay. I also couldn't hear that. I'm sorry.
Fine, it's like make everybody play Grand Theft Auto.
Okay. And then what?
See if they reenact some of the action, which I hope that does not happen.
Yeah. So maybe we put 4 people in a room and we have them play Madden, and then we have them play GTA. For the other group, we flip it. And we see if the group that played Grand Theft Auto breaks out into some big brawl. Or go steal cars or something. However, causation is inherently hard to prove. Right? If you read scientific research articles that are trying to infer causation, you'll see a lot of quipping back and forth between different camps that say, no, that's not the cause. Right? The cause was maybe a response bias. Maybe you induced some sort of social facilitation effect such that people wanted to respond in a certain way to give you what you were looking for. You also want to get out of a sterile lab environment and into the real world. Right? So a very legitimate criticism of psychology is that psychology isn't the study of the human mind. It's the study of affluent 18 to 22-year-olds. Right? Because that's the population usually. Y'all are going into these lab environments and doing these studies. And from there, we're trying to extrapolate to the population. Now, for some effects, we wouldn't expect any sort of age difference. Right? We assume that your eyeballs work the exact same as an 80-year-old's eyeballs. May work better, but work in the same functional manner. However, sometimes we need to get out of that quote-unquote sterile lab environment and go out into the real world and see what the cause and effect is. So, for example, before I came here, when I was at the Air Force Academy, we were doing research on autonomous driving. And a lot of autonomous driving research has been done in a sterile lab environment simulator. Right? But there aren't any consequences with over-trusting a self-driving car in a simulator, right? You crash, who cares? You're fine. But obviously, once you get out into the real world, over-trusting the self-driving car has real consequences. And so you're likely to see differences in people's response patterns, and also in maybe their physiological response to when the car is about to crash. So we also have different types of research methods. One is a case study. And this focuses on an individual or an instance in depth. It takes one person and tries to pick apart all the facets that can explain whatever it is of interest. Right? And so, while it's a grim example, you'll see this a lot after, for instance, mass shootings. A case study of the individual. We want to know what led this person to do that. Right? That's not an experimental setting. We're not trying to replicate that event. We want to dig in deep to that person's family life and social atmosphere, etc. It's also good for studies that would otherwise be unethical to do. Right? There are some things like brain lesions, where people have lost part of their brain or had it surgically removed. That's not ethical. I can't say, do you want research credit? Well, you got to let me take apart your brain. That's what we're going to do here. It's also good for very rare cases. Right? Instances of something that maybe you don't see all that often. And so with very rare types of illnesses or diseases, you may only get 2 or 3 people in the world that you could actually study. And that's not enough to do the type of statistics we would otherwise hope to do. And so that's when you're really digging deep. However, case studies are bad because they can also be misleading. Right? There can be all sorts of circumstances that lead to whatever that event is. Right? So, let's say we wanted to study what made Tiger Woods arguably the best golfer of all time. Well, we can look through his history and say, okay, he had arguably an emotionally abusive father. And so some people could say, okay, well that was what led him to practice as much and get as good as he was. Or it may have nothing to do with that, right? There are certain things you're picking up on that are salient that can be misleading about the true causes. It's very subject to interpretation. Right? When we talk about confirmation bias, you see what you want to see. You get the information you want to get. And so if I have a theory that broccoli made Tiger Woods the best golfer ever, me going through and asking, okay, what did he have for dinner most nights? No, it wasn't broccoli? But he had broccoli a couple times a year, didn't he? Yeah, that seems more frequent than I did, so it's probably the broccoli. And it could be other factors you don't know that are contributing. Right? Maybe you don't have access to that information. Maybe you didn't ask the right question, or maybe that information wasn't recorded. If you're relying on somebody else to record all the information, a chronology, or a diary, maybe the information that's most relevant isn't there. We can also use what we call naturalistic observation. So the goal is to record behavior in the natural environment without intervening. You don't want people to know they're being observed. This tends to be good for studying behaviors that may be societally or socially inappropriate or frowned upon. Right? If you bring somebody into a lab and say, how many times do you hit your kid? Or how many racist thoughts do you have? People are going to say 0. Right? We've all agreed, societally, that these are bad things. But in reality, people do hit their kids, and people do have racist thoughts or behaviors. And so, by studying it out in the real world, you're able to get a better understanding of what is the true ground truth, besides just bringing them into the lab. It's also good because that has ecological validity. You're getting out of the sterile lab environment and into the real world, and so now you can see what are the things that may contribute to whatever that behavior is. And it doesn't just have to be societally inappropriate. It's also bad because you don't have control of other variables. Right? And so if you want to infer causation, you don't have the type of control necessary to actually infer those causal links. You also have surveys, and I'm sure everybody has taken surveys an abundant number of times to this point in their life. All it does is ask about your behavior or opinion. One of the nice things about it is it's good for collecting a lot of data really quickly. If you want to know how many times people sneeze on average throughout the day, it may make sense to ask them for their response of how many times they sneeze that day, rather than following them around for a day and counting the number of times they sneeze and then going to the next person. good for use outside of just a local community. So again, if I don't want to study just 18 to 22-year-olds, maybe it makes sense to send this out. Maybe I want to get information from retirees, so I send it out to a retirement home to get their beliefs. Getting at beliefs that are hard to study through behavior. So for example, have you ever been in love? Well, you may have some sort of operationalization of what love looks like, but it may not make sense to just go sit in a park and try to count the number of people who seem like they're in love. And that's supposed to say random sampling is easier rather than easier. But it's also bad because subtle changes of the wording can change how people respond, right? And so we showed that with the framing bias last time. How I frame the question I'm going to ask elicits a different response. And you can see this all the time in political polls. They'll say, 80% of people approve of whatever this bill is. Well, half the time it's because the bill is named something so obviously good that it wouldn't make sense to say, yeah, I'm opposed to it. If it's the Feed Every Child Act, most people are not going to say, without some sort of understanding about the bill, no, I don't want to feed every child. Despite random sampling, you can still get a response bias. Right? So think back to the 2016 election. All of the predicting surveys before the election had Hillary leading by, I think, 5 points. Right? And that led people to have some sort of expectation as to what the actual outcome of the election would be. And it turned out not to be the case. Finally, people don't always know what they think. Right? We've already given examples in this class. You think you've got an idea, but in reality, you're really good at backfilling explanations for things you didn't know you believed. All right, so talk with your neighbor. What type of methods would you use to answer the following questions? Do parents like one of their kids more than another? What impact does having a rare disease have on a child's aggressive behavior? Do people prefer Pepsi or Coke more? How often do people pick their noses in public? And what might have caused Osama bin Laden to become radicalized?
Specific for everything. Have lots of when they're after they want but it's probably easier. It's really hard to respond. You could also have give you a big list of items where they describe each of their kids or something like that, and then overall you can see but that would be what impact that's probably also
All right, so what type of method are we using to answer whether parents like one of their kids more than the other? Yeah, naturalistic observation. They're probably not going to report that they like either kid more than the other in surveys. Unless you're my mom, and then she would say she likes me more than my brother. He's not here to defend it. Or is she? No, that's fact. What impact is having a rare disease on a child's aggressive behavior? I heard some mumbling, but I didn't hear anything resolved. Case study.
Or naturalist.
Yeah. So it depends on how rare it is, right? So if it's extremely rare, maybe a case study makes more sense. If it's something that's rare in the sense that not a whole bunch of people have it, but enough people have it to know where they congregate, then yeah. I mean, maybe, if it's a conference for kids with lupus, again, I don't know what lupus is, but I keep using it as an example. You could see what effect that has on a child's aggressive behavior. What about preferring Pepsi or Coke more? Survey. What's that?
I say personal bias or even branding.
Yeah, so you could use a survey. You could also probably use a naturalistic observation. Just sit right in front of the soda dispenser. See Coke or Pepsi. One of the things that tripped me up when I moved south is that some people say Coke to mean all soda, which means you can have the following conversation. What would you like to drink? A Coke? What type? A Coke? How often do people pick their noses in public? Probably naturalistic. Probably not many people are willing to admit that to a survey. And what about what would have caused OBL to become radicalized? What's that?
Case study.
Yes, case study. Perfect. Questions about the different research methods? All make sense? Cool. We also then have experimentation. Right? So in experiments allow researchers to infer causation. Dr. Leo Spacimen is the greatest character that's ever been on TV. If you don't know who he is, from 30 Rock, you need to go watch it. But it's great. It's single best character, not best show. But yes, in this case I am. So experiments allow, again, for us to infer causation because we're actually manipulating variables rather than just observing. And we do it with two different groups. We call one group the experimental group, and the other group the control group. We randomly assign participants to the groups, so there's no sort of bias in the data that way. And then we try to change only one variable at a time. Changing more than one variable at a time can lead to confounds and interactions that make things difficult to interpret. And so, excuse me, you may have heard of this in medical research. You may hear things like double-blind, placebo-controlled. And so in this case, double-blind means neither the experimenter nor the participant knows what condition the participant's in. Right? Because you can have effects where if I, as the experimenter, know what condition you're in, I may not intend to, but maybe I change my behavior in a way that affects the results. And then the placebo-controlled is that control group. Placebo is just a sugar pill. It's used to provide cover, right? If you were to come in for a medical study, let's say I wanted to see if Zoloft works, and I say you're going to participate in the study, you're either going to get Zoloft or you're not, and you say, okay, where's the pill? I go, oh no, you don't get a pill. Well, obviously you know you're in the non-Zoloft condition, right? And so we want to be able to give you a sugar pill so you still think you're taking the drug, and there may be a chance that you're taking the actual active ingredients. So if both the placebo and experimental group get better, we know it wasn't the medicine having an effect, unless the group in the actual medicine condition got more better. Betterer. Interestingly enough, and you may have heard about this, but the placebo effect is a real thing. and can explain the result of people getting better when they're not actually taking any real substance. Right? And so, if you've got some sort of pain, I can give you a placebo that's not going to actually help with the pain, but if you think it's going to help with the pain, your pain is actually lessened. Interestingly enough, this placebo effect can interface with everything from depression to psychosomatic symptoms. So psychosomatic symptoms are things like you have a pain, but there's no obvious cause of the pain, and so it may just be in your head. My mom's an MD, and she said when she was in her residency, they had a patient who, after all these tests and all the blood work and everything like that, thought that the patient just had, this psychosomatic injury or psychosomatic pain. And so they went to an ethics board to request permission to give them a placebo pill to treat the pain. And it turns out it fixed the pain for the patient. So you can think about the placebo effect existing in a whole bunch of different domains. And it's why you see things that have no basis in reality eliciting changes in overall behavior or cognition. And I don't want to pick on any of them in particular, because if they're helping you, that's great, and I want them to help you, and so I'm not going to say what some of these examples are. But chances are, if you can buy it over the counter at a gas station and it doesn't have to be prescribed, it may not have the same sort of effects that you would otherwise think. And that's not I realize that sounds like I'm picking on CBD, and that's not. CBD actually has real properties. Yeah?
Do you have to tell the patients eventually afterwards that
So-
they had the placebo, or like?
Like in the actual tests? So there's a process we call debriefing, and so usually after the fact, they'll say, we didn't give you the pill, we gave you a placebo, but here is access to other, either here's to the experimental drug or to other drugs that seem to be the industry standard. And so in most cases in medical research, you're still required to give them the option after the fact, but you don't want them to know until. Good question. Any other questions about that?
Well, they also should know going in that they might have a placebo that they might.
Yeah, so they'll be told ahead of time that there's a possibility they're not given the active ingredient. So with a lot of these tests, it's not the case. If you come in with a life-threatening disease and there's some other option, it's really hard to get approval to run these types of studies, because it would be unethical for me to withhold treatment for somebody who could be saved. But you see a lot of these sort of tests on either kind of mundane things, or not necessarily mundane, but things that aren't life-threatening, or things for which there's no absolute cure, right? And so you'll see this a lot with cancer drugs of, we don't have anything at this point to help you get better and live longer, but we're going to try this experimental drug. And it may help you, or it may not. So, yeah?
So is that the same for like the patient after? Would he still get told after that it was a placebo, or that caused it to come?
That's a good question. I don't know.
Because like theoretically, then once you tell him, when he's getting like the same symptoms again.
Maybe. It also is possible that you begin to realize, oh wait, it was all in your head. And so there are cases of what we call phantom limb pain. So after people have had an amputation, sometimes they feel pain in a limb that doesn't exist anymore. And there are various ways you can convince the brain that it's not something to be interpreting as a pain signal, right? So one example is people report having pain associated with just like having a clenched fist in an arm that's been amputated. And so there's a therapy where you put a mirror in front of them so it makes it look like with their other hand, they've got two hands. And it's essentially telling the brain, look, this hand isn't balled up. The brain relaxes and it doesn't go back to clenching up after you take away that mirror. And so I don't know what the case is, but yeah, it's very rare. I think, to ever prescribe somebody a placebo. I think they usually do it when it's better to try this route going through an ethics committee than giving them opiates or things like that. Other questions?
So
Yeah.
from a legal standpoint, you need to tell them what you're giving them.
Well, and that's where the ethics board, I think, came in that situation, of there are precautions to say, and I don't know all the facts about this specific case, but there is the ethics board where you say, look, we have to decide for this patient what's the best route. We don't think there's any reason that they have actual pain. Can we try this route that has no downside, right? A placebo pill is not going to get people hooked like an opiate might. And so, with things like that, any sort of deception in the research or medical communities require stringent ethics board oversight to make sure that they are still protecting the patient in those cases. So, yeah.
It might also be concerned if they don't think anything's wrong, incorrectly prescribing something.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that's probably part of the argument of, okay, why don't we try this? And you have to go justify it before a board like that. But other questions? So I've been using the term variable kind of broadly up to this point. But in research, we have three different categories of variables: independent, dependent, and confounding. And I'm sure all of y'all have seen at least independent and dependent before in science classes. But independent variables are the ones you directly manipulate in an experiment. So, for example, will amount of caffeine consumed have an impact on quality of sleep? What's the independent variable that we've manipulated in this study? Yeah, the amount of caffeine. So I want to see what this variable does on the other variable. So maybe I give one group 50 milligrams caffeine, another 150 milligrams, and a third group 300 milligrams throughout the day. And that's what I've manipulated. That's the independent variable. And I'm interested in what its effect is on the dependent variable. These are the variables you're testing the effect on, or the result on. So, in this example, will eating more fish result in a higher IQ? What's the dependent variable?
IQ.
IQ. Yes. Yes, so you're manipulating the amount of fish eaten, and you're interested in what its result is on the dependent variable. People always get these flipped. Dependent just means it's dependent on the changes in the independent. We're running out of time here, so I'm going a little quick. And then you have what we call a confounding variable. So a confounding variable is one that could have an impact on the results of the study other than the independent variable. Right? We have something we specifically want to test, but it could be something we haven't controlled for that could be influencing it. So an example of a research question is, eating more fish lead to a higher IQ? Potentially confounding example would be by eating more fish, maybe they're eating less sugar, and so it's sugar that's having an effect on IQ and not the actual fish itself. There was a case of this a couple years ago that was published. Rats are used for a lot of early studies, especially medically related studies. What they found is that when a male experimenter went into a room, the rats and mice got more stressed, released more cortisol, which was having an effect on the actual results, right? And so you think about the fact that you have pain management studies. If a male researcher is walking in and administering the drug, and every time the male researcher walks in, the rat is releasing more cortisol, it dampens the pain response in general. And so it's not the drug necessarily that's affecting the pain response for the rat or the mouse, but it's the researcher themselves that could be having that effect. running out. Let's see, how are we doing? We still have a lot of slides. That seems like a good place to stop. Everybody have a good weekend, and I will see you on Tuesday. And we do have class on Tuesday, as we've just decided.